Good morning, students. Recall that last week we treated chapter 8, European exploration of the river Niger. Then in that chapter 8, we discovered that following the successful exploration of the river Niger in 1830 by the Lander brothers Richard and John, that the interior part of West Africa, the hinterland of Nigeria, could be reached successfully. Thus, the traders, European missionaries, and many European explorers, most of them entered for the first time the interior part of Nigeria. The trade in cash crops, the trade in non-human beings had series of consequences. The transition led to serious displacement of a lot of people. It had economic consequences, it had political consequences, it has social consequences. The transition brought the Europeans closer to Nigeria, and it enabled them to exert political control in the ports and later in parts of the hinterland. We've seen how a transition from one form of trade to another form of trade, which the Europeans called legitimate trade. The implication is that the former trade, which was on human being, was now regarded and seen as illegitimate trade. The trade in articles, the trade in cash crops, later became known as the legitimate trade. So in this chapter 9, we are going to look at the objectives, and we say that at the end of this study, students should be able to, 1, account for the reasons why the Europeans remained behind after the abolition of this trade. The reason why we want to know the reason why Europeans stayed behind is Europe, Britain, abolished slave trade in 1807 in British soil, and in 1833 they abolished slave trade in all British Empire. One would have expected, since the trade on human beings have been abolished, that Europeans in West Africa, Europeans in Nigeria should have left Nigeria. They did not go. So in this study, we will look at the reasons why Europeans remained behind after the abolition of the slave trade. Secondly, we will define and say what legitimate trade actually means. The third one, we will examine the trade in raw material, or the so-called legitimate trade in Nigeria. And finally, we will look at the organization of this legitimate trade and its impact in Nigeria. So we look at this subheading, why Europeans in Africa did not leave after the abolition of slave trade. And we say that many people in Africa thought that with the abolition of slave trade, Europeans in West Africa will leave the region. But they did not leave as a result of the following. Number one, the European traders had invested tremendous capital in trading equipment in the nature of forts, hawks, and ships on the West African coast, and they could not afford to lose such capital. Secondly, the Europeans found out that a substitute for the slave trade could be developed in the forest products of West Africa, such as palm oil, groundnut, coffee, gum, rubber, cotton, timber, ivory, and indigo, and later cocoa. These products were then in great demand in Europe. European traders therefore remained to carry on the developing of lucrative trade in these products. The third point is the successful exploration of the Niger by the Lander brothers in 1830, which opened new possibilities for legitimate trade with the interior. So the traders began to develop the Niger into a commercial highway to the heart of West Africa. Having successfully seen the reasons why the Europeans remained in African soil after the abolishment of the slave trade, we now ask ourselves, this trade, which was Christians' legitimate trade, what does it mean? And we say that legitimate trade was a commercial relationship between Europeans and Africans soon after the abolition of slave trade during the 19th century. This trade was called legitimate, that is legal, which means it replaced illegal, that is illegitimate trade, which was slave trade. The items involved were non-human, that is raw materials from West Africa like peanuts, cocoa, ivory, and palm oil, which were exchanged with manufactured goods from Europe like guns, clothes, drinks, mirror, to mention but a few. The development of legitimate trade was the final phase of private and official British effort to find a positive alternative to the traffic in slaves. Earlier aspects of such constructive interest had included the founding of the colony at Sierra Leone in 1787 as a refuge for liberated slaves. The missionary movement designed to bring Christianity to the region, and programs of exploration sponsored by learned societies and scientific groups such as the London-based British African Association. We now look at the importance of legitimate trade. This legitimate trade is important as a result of what happened to Africa. It was the first time Africa as a continent was connected to international trade. As a result of the legitimate trade, African countries became centers of economic activities. African economy was integrated into the world economic system through the relationship between African producers and European manufacturers and industrialists. We looked at the importance of legitimate trade. We now look at the effects of the development of legitimate trade in Nigeria. And we say that one of the effects of the development of legitimate trade is there began for the first time an era of trade in which the people of West Africa exported the products of their farms instead of selling themselves as commodities to European traders. They thus began to recover their human dignity, which was considerably belittled by the slave trade. Secondly, the legitimate trade attracted large numbers of European traders and companies to West Africa. These European firms played a major role in the boosting of the economy of the state of West Africa. Their quest for African produce stimulated Africans to free, healthy, and productive labor within their own continent. Thirdly, the growth of legitimate trade had also important political consequences. It was in response to the appeals by European traders to their governments to establish peaceful conditions and break the opposition of African middlemen that British, French, and German governments became involved in the affairs of African states in the 19th century. Their involvement eventually resulted in the territorial acquisition of West African states. Before we end this lecture on the growth of legitimate trade, remember we said that the legitimate trade led to British or European interventions in the local politics of the Nigerian people. Yes, we will give some instances. In 1851, Lagos was conquered by Britain. 10 years after, in 1861, Lagos was annexed. We take another instance of what happened in Bonny, where Britain intervened and removed King Dapo Pego and put his cousin brother. In Calabar, the British also intervened when Obon Ashibon I died. The British consul John Beecroft also intervened in the selection of the new Obong of Calabar. We've seen how this chapter 9, the growth of the legitimate trade, how it connected Nigeria and other West African countries into international trade. Next week, we will treat chapter 10, which is titled Christian Missions in Nigeria. Thank you.